This is Jonathan Ferguson, the Keeper of Firearms and Artillery at the Royal Armouries Museum in the UK, which houses a collection of thousands of iconic weapons from throughout history. And on this episode, Jonathan's taking another look at the Vietnam-era weaponry of Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, a game that he really liked the look of the last time around.
Before I forget to mention it, I feel the need to comment on the white gloves that we see in the player character in a couple of these clips. I gather that's from some sort of DLC, but it made me chuckle as somebody who wears white cotton gloves quite a bit.
If you want to see our previous episode on Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, make sure to go check it out. We've got a handy link down in the description of this video. But make sure to watch this episode as well, yeah? And of course, while you're down there, make sure to subscribe as well, as we've got tons of content just like this on the channel, including Loadout, a show where we take a look at the history and impact of some of the most iconic weapons in gaming, from the shotgun and M1 Garand all the way through to the Desert Eagle and the minigun. We collaborated with Jonathan on Loadout too, so he'll be making a fair few appearances on that show as well. Right, let's take a look at the guns of Rising Storm 2 Vietnam.
Now, this is a really fun one for me because I have actually, to my knowledge, never looked at our K50 submachine guns. Now, this is a North Vietnamese licensed copy of the PPSH or Papasha, whichever you prefer, 41 Soviet submachine gun. It's really quite crude. I don't know how well you'll be able to see that on camera, but it definitely looks more like sort of bent and hammered steel. It doesn't have the iconic wooden shotgun type stock of the PPSH. It has a sort of welded together, very heavy gauge sheet steel lower receiver, and it makes the thing really quite heavy. And the rate of fire is preserved from the PPSH, so it's pretty much as blistering as you see in the game there. A good 700 rounds per minute plus. I think it's probably a bit more than that. So we've got only 35 rounds in the magazine, but at sort of 700-800 rounds per minute. That goes quickly. Unlike the PPSH, famous for its 71 round drum magazine, this variant, if you like, or derivative, does not have that capability. They were not made, they were not acquired, and when you slide the stock shut, you can sort of see why, because it prevents the drum. The curve of the drum would be in the way. Shotguns. What we've got there is the Ithaca Model 37, which is a pretty iconic Vietnam shotgun. So much so that James Cameron put it in Aliens, which is famously a bit of a Vietnam allegory in space. It's subtext, but it's relatively in-your-face subtext. And so for Hicks's shotgun, they literally give him an antique, a family heirloom, as he puts it, which is a Vietnam vintage Ithaca.
I'd like to keep this handy for close encounters.
The only one I think that we have in the collection is this very sporting trim version of the Ithaca, so it's different in various details. I say sporting, this is actually marketed as a police variant, but this one is engraved with some relatively crude headless ducks, which is a little disturbing. I'm not really sure why the ducks are headless and flying through the air. I don't think engraving on not budget shotguns, but mainstream shotguns is quite what it was in previous decades. I think probably the main identifier of the Ithaca is the lack of an ejection port on the side. You can't see the bolt. That all happens underneath. By Vietnam, we had several attempts at bayonet-equipped shotguns, going back to the 1897 trench gun of the First World War. Basically the same idea, but done on what was then in the inventory. So the Ithaca 37 with a perforated heat shield on it so you don't burn your hands while you're grasping the barrel to stab somebody in the face, and a mount for the, I believe it was still the Model 1917 bayonet, same as it was previously. And it's one of those conflicts where something like that sort of worked. So at any sort of jungle warfare, a shotgun is going to be a lot more useful than it would be in a lot of other conditions. Of course, it does still limit you, as you'll no doubt find out playing the game. If the only weapon you've got is something that's very good up to maybe 50 meters and not very good beyond it, you are a little bit limited in what you can do. But that's the whole point of having a squad of other soldiers equipped with a variety of weapons. And for up close and personal, you can't beat a pump action.
We are taking Delta.
The M14 is quite a fascinating rifle. In many ways, it's not very remarkable. It was a very conservative take on a future infantry rifle. There were many more advanced designs around at the time in the 50s when it was being adopted. And it's the culmination of a long, torturous story that's actually in my new book about British bullpups, because Britain was trying to foist its very high-tech, fully automatic, optically sighted bullpup assault rifle on its allies, including America, and they weren't having it. They went full conservative, kind of let's stay with what we know, and they basically slapped a box magazine and an improved gas system on the M1 Garand. It wasn't really enough of an improvement, and although the M14 had a relative reputation for reliability and being a sort of man-stopper, it lasted only 7 years in US Army service, which I think is the shortest lived service rifle in US history. A very interesting rifle, maybe not the best for Vietnam, but I'm not going to second guess veterans that were there and actually used it.
Look out for traps. Laying down suppressing fire.
We go from the M14 to its descendant, I suppose, immediate descendant, the M21 sniper rifle, or at this stage the XM. X, of course, meaning experimental. This is a real thing. This was in use in the late 60s as one of a number of weapons that were effectively field trialed. The interesting thing for me here is the suppressor. We have both versions in the game, suppressed and unsuppressed. And we see the player is operating the bolt. It might surprise some people, but if you played the game or you know a bit about how this works, subsonic ammunition, depending on the type of weapon, does not generate sufficient pressure to cycle the action of the weapon. So by using reduced power ammunition to get a lower report, so the suppressor can suppress it more effectively, you don't get the crack of the bullet as it goes through the air. You lose the ability to fire rapid follow-up shots. So you're going back in time in terms of your rifle's capability for as long as you're using the suppressor and the subsonic ammunition. Now, what a lot of games get wrong is putting a suppressor on the weapon does not magically, well, in a couple of cases it does, but generally it does not magically reduce the velocity of the bullet and therefore does not make the ammunition subsonic. What generally happens, certainly in this case, you would need special subsonic ammunition to get that extra quiet effect where the enemy doesn't get the crack of the bullet, isn't alerted to where they're getting shot at from. Now in this game gets around that gameplay compromise of when you put the suppressor on, your ammo goes subsonic, by having the two different variants. So you've either got the suppressor and you're loading subsonic ammo, or you've not got the suppressor and you're loading supersonic ammo. Subsonic ammunition did make it to Vietnam by at least one account from a veteran, but allegedly the sort of quality control on the amount of powder in the cases was not great, and 1 in 4 cartridges was still making a supersonic crack. So those probably would cycle the action, but you'd lose your otherwise very quiet but still quite powerful rifle.
Trouble.
Good old Mosin, the 3-line rifle as it was known in Russia, was in Vietnam, as it has been in so many conflicts, as a bit of a hand-me-down from an earlier era. But if you could find a good one that wasn't shot out and was accurate when it was made, this was the key thing with the Mosin rifle, is it could be a very capable, accurate sniper rifle, but many of them were made hastily and not particularly well, and are not fit to be sniper rifles. But the ones that are, shoot well, and would serve you well. The interesting thing about this implementation, we've got I think it was a PU scope on there, is that has enough, well, it has the downside of a height over bore, so that your point of aim, point of impact has to be factored in, but it means that you can see under the scope body the iron sights, and you can just use the iron sights for closer up work. That said, the scope mount kind of obstructs your field of view anyway, so how useful that is will probably depend on the situation and how good a shooter you were.
One of the bastards.
This is not as instant as an M16 or an AK or an M60 as a Vietnam firearm, but if you're Australian or you know of their involvement, it pretty much is. This is, of course, the Owen Gun, which is perhaps best thought of as a parallel universe Sten gun. It's a similar design remit, something to fire a pistol cartridge relatively rapidly, very cheaply. Probably most notable for that top-mounted magazine, which we see being flipped over and pulled out at the top of the gun in the reload animation. So this was a Lieutenant Evelyn Owen, so it's a bit of a homebrew. This is one where a serving soldier, or officer in this case, came up with his own design, and the military procurement authorities were sufficiently impressed that they trialled it and actually adopted it. Although I've mentioned the Sten gun, the Owen is much more of an original design. It is not the Osten. It's important to distinguish the two. So the Owen gun is the more indigenous design, if you like. The Osten is the Australian take, using the available manufacturing methods and skills on the Sten gun. So it's the Sten gun adapted to Australian industry. The Owen is better thought of because it is more original, I think. It's become the more iconic of the two. And it's the one that you tend to encounter in the context of the Aussies in Vietnam. The RPD, designed as part of a new system of small arms that included the SKS, and this was the squad support weapon, so using the same intermediate power 7.62 by 39mm cartridge. Found to be a bit lacking and ultimately sort of phased out in favour of the much better PK as a sort of squad level belt-fed machine gun. But as with a lot of Soviet weapons, lots were already made. It functioned fine for the most part, so they found their way into other trouble spots, including Vietnam, and that's why it makes sense here. Before I forget to mention it, I feel the need to comment on the white gloves that we see in the player character in a couple of these clips. I gather that's from some sort of DLC, but it made me chuckle as somebody who wears white cotton gloves quite a bit. Anyway, what those gloves are holding is the SKS, the Simonov carbine. Why have a semi-automatic weapon in the same caliber as the AK? So the answer is that the immediate need was for a self-loading rifle, but it had already been identified that the reduced power cartridge was the way to go, and it already identified that you would need an assault rifle. What was less clear in 1945 was that the assault rifle could in fact replace every rifle in the infantry squad. The plan in 45 with this new intermediate cartridge was to leverage the benefits of low recoil, therefore better semi-automatic accuracy. The AK was going to be for specialist troops. And so you'd have a two-tier system. You'd have the assault rifle for those that needed automatic fire, and you'd have the SKS as your standard infantry rifle. But of course, from 1949 onwards, when the AK has been introduced, very quickly it's clear that the AK is the way to go. It does everything the SKS does and more, and especially for Soviet doctrine, which called for automatic burst fire as the default way to fire your rifle in most situations, it made sense to bin the SKS, and so it became a reserve weapon, and hundreds of thousands of them found their way around the world. The SKS has its own interesting story behind it, and there were lots of them in Vietnam. If you'd like to support the work that we do here at the Royal Armouries, both with GameSpot and over on our own channel, have a look at the video description. We have a couple of links for you in there. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.